Welcome to the program. Carlo Ruzza joins us today. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Trento in Italy. He is an accomplished sociologist, having earned his master's degree from Harvard University in 1986 and his PhD 5 years later in 1991. He is the author of several books and many papers, or contributor to many papers and research on a variety of topics, most importantly and most recently, the impact of populism on European institutions and civil society. He has a wide range of expertise and knowledge in this space, and I thought it was very important that we take an episode on this program to talk about this, because if our objective is to talk about the big global trends that impact everybody and everything from business to individuals, there are few trends that have emerged more rapidly and more definitively around the world than the topic of populist politics and a return to a more nationalist view of international affairs, where countries put their own interests not just ahead of others, as you might expect, but even when it's clear that working with other countries may add to a better collective benefit, the impulse to simply focus on one's own borders and focus within one's own country and society is the paramount imperative for all politicians in the society. So I didn't want to dive deep into the American populism of this yet. We'll have time to do that throughout 2024 as our elections move forward. But we had the opportunity to interview Carlo about Europe, which I feel in many ways is already several years ahead of the United States and maybe elsewhere in the world in terms of elected officials coming into office, instituting policies, governing, not just running as populists and nationalists, but governing. And I also think there's been a little bit of confusion among some and people of good intention about what these terms mean. In some areas of media, you'll hear the term populism derided and put in the same category as Nazism or far right wing bigoted politics. Um, in other arenas, you hear it in the left wing term, and it's viewed as communist or it's viewed as far left wing propaganda. And the term nationalism is also meaning different things to different people. For some, it's simply being patriotic, and yes, maybe putting your country first as a priority, but not necessarily to the total ignorance or detriment of the rest of the world. But to others, nationalism truly means isolationism. It means a focus on oneself to the complete exclusion of the rest. Well, there's no one better than a sociologist to ask these questions to and to get their opinions, and people who've spent time researching this and understanding how the public thinks about these topics, how elected officials and politicians and political movements are trying to use them, and where we are in that process. And I know that many of our European listeners are already well aware of where these movements lie on the continent. I don't think everybody around the world necessarily does. So this show is an attempt to give us a baseline understanding of these topics and trends, and to talk a little bit about where we think it might be going and the impacts it has. And let me be clear as we get the show going that this is a dispassionate view of this. I and Carlo are not here to say that populist nationalist politics are a good thing. We're not here to tell you that it's a bad thing. We think it's important that you're just informed about what it really is. Let's take the hyperbole out of this topic. Let's understand it. And let's talk a little bit about practical policies and impacts to daily life. So I hope you find this program informative. I hope you find this episode worth sharing with your friends and with your academic community, as well as with your professional community and your neighbors. If you like what you hear today, I encourage you to subscribe to the show if you're not already a subscriber. You can find us anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Odyssey, and any of the other popular apps out there. You can find clips of this show and others on my YouTube channel. Just search Brian J. Matos on YouTube. And if all else fails, you can always find new episodes and special content and blog entries and show notes on my website, brianjmatos.com. Carlo was generous enough to spend about 50 minutes with us, so I look forward to hearing back from you all your thoughts on this. Stick with us at the end of the program. I'll give a few quick thoughts, personal thoughts, post interview. But in the meantime, it's my pleasure to present to you my conversation with a professor of sociology from the University of Trento in Italy, Carlo Ruzza. Okay, so let's begin with a foundational understanding when we talk about the term rule of law. Explain that to our audience as understood commonly around the world, because it's a topic we're going to be talking about and coming back to several times in this interview.
Okay, thanks. So, rule of law obviously is a term that is mainly used by lawyers and academic lawyers in particular, but increasingly is also used by political scientists and political sociologists. And the reason why it's becoming popular beyond the academic and legal circles is that because a number of populist governments and parties are interpreting it in different ways from what was the traditional way of interpreting it. The traditional way was basically very closely connected to protecting democracy. That is a set of institutions that balance each other through a set of rules. So there are checks and balances so that the judiciary or the executive are not, overwhelming and stepping over what the proper role should be. So what is happening instead is that there are different definitions of the rule of law by different parties. And particularly by populist parties, the rule of law is basically the will of the people, as it is interpreted by usually a political party and a powerful leader. A powerful leader that is therefore not so much careful about all the other branches of the executives and the judiciary and so on, particularly the judiciary. When we say rule of law, we also mean another thing. We mean that there should be a democracy made of interacting institutions that balance each other, but there also should be some kind of free public sphere, a free press, and a role for intermediary organizations such as NGOs, for instance, chambers of commerce, and other intermediary organizations. Now, typically, populist parties don't believe in this intermediation. They prefer a direct connection between the leader and what they think is the people, and therefore they are generally oriented to not giving very much power to this intermediary space of civil society, of associations, and so on. So the rule of law then also encompasses this other space, and also encompasses a set of legal protections of civil society and of the free press, which again sometimes is neglected because it's seen as overstepping the role of political decision making as embedded by populist leaders.
So let's talk about the term populism as well. It's another topic we're going to cover throughout the conversation today. Populism can be understood to be either extreme. It can be left, it can be right, and it can be embodied by individuals or it can be embodied by parties. But again, just to level set us on how you're interpreting it and how you think about it, help us define populism in the term of modern politics.
Right. So probably the best way to answer this question is to go through very, very quickly the history of populism studies, how populism came to be an important academic topic. So obviously the word populism suggests the power of the people, of the government, of the rule of the people. And most politics would argue that they are there to represent something that they call the people. But this type of representation is not so obvious and is done differently by different social groups, by different political parties. So when we say populism today, we typically refer to a particular political view that thinks that there should be an immediate and direct connection between this unified entity that we call the people and a political entity, which is usually a party or a leader. Basically, the idea is that there should be very little in between these two poles. So populism is first and foremost a direct connection, a direct representation between people and decision-making structures. Secondly, populism is based on the fundamental idea, that this connection between the people and their representatives is hindered by evil forces, normally enemies, normally elites, normally evil elites. And these evil elites would be different in different types of populist parties. They would typically be scheming capitalists for the left. There would be the Masonic, plutocratic, Judaic world of scheming elites by the right. But the important point is the concept of the enemy. Populism is about an enemy that you have to fight. So this is what populism is. Now, populism, as I defined it now, is mainly an ideology, is a way of viewing the world. But the literature on populism sort of moved on from this very simplistic way of conceptualizing it, that is, as an ideology, and started to focus on different aspects. A second aspect that was important, especially a few years ago, was conceiving populism not only as an ideology, but simply as a theatrical set of actions, basically as a style of politics. And so they tended to emphasize the fact that populism is basically about acting in an unprecedented, disruptive, violent, sometimes even illogical and contradictory way. So populism as an ideology first, then populism as a style. And acting this way was seen as particularly useful and particularly accepted by those underrepresented groups of society that felt that the whole system needed to be shaken up, needed to be disrupted. So there's a disruptive element there, and the disruptive element that is embedded in a style. Then another approach to populism, and again, what I'm saying here is that populism is different things. It's not just one thing. It's an ideology, it's a style, but then again, is also something else, which is basically a set of emotions. Particularly the feeling of being betrayed, particularly the feeling of being not listened to, particularly the feeling of being on the losing part of history. And this losing aspect is basically concentrated in different ways, but mainly especially in Europe, in two main areas. One is the losers of globalization. People who basically did not profit from the process of European integration, for instance, and they feel that their salaries are not sufficient, and they resent that. So there's an element of resentment. And the second is migration, the feeling that the world is not your home anymore. The world is something that makes you feel homeless, because there are different cultures, because there are different languages, because there are different religions that you don't accept. So a set of emotions, and key among these emotions is the emotion of being marginalized, and so feelings of resentment. So these three aspects, the stylistic element, the ideological element, and the emotional element, are the core of what populism is. But then again, populism could be seen from the left and the right according to what exactly is the enemy.
So is there a inherent battle between the rule of law and populism and populist parties? Is a populist party always seeking to topple or challenge or degrade a society built around the rule of law? Or can these two things be compatible?
I mean, they can be compatible, but they're not easily compatible. Basically, what we are saying is that populists, to simplify things, and non-populists have different views of what political representation is. For non-populists, political representation is the voice of a set of different entities, different institutions, often contradicting each other, often coming to different and difficult compromises. And so the rule of law essentially is a very global, very fragmented, very articulated set of types of representation. Representation is representation of civil society, is representation of the press, is representation of the judges, is representation of political parties that are marginalized, that don't make in the parliament, and so on. For the populists, first, the idea is that representation is first and foremost representation by a people. And the people is conceptualized as an entity that is unified, that is one thing. You know? So all these other aspects of representation are betraying the true representation of the people. So there is a much more simple, more clear type of representation, and therefore is a representation that doesn't need all the protections of the rule of law. That in fact is better when these other entities, the press, civil society, and so on, are marginalized. So would that be something that makes the rule of law possible? Yes, in a way, a very minimalist rule of law, a very simple rule of law would be possible, but not the kind of rule of law that democracy as a thought, as a set of checks and balances constructed and idealized over centuries has produced. And this is where the difference is.
So another concept we should also cover before we start tying it all together is nationalism. Understood broadly as the focus on one's country as a priority over anything else around the world, and sometimes seen as people feeling like their country is being left behind or their country is being undermined in some way by international institutions. But again, just so we're all on the same playing field, I want your definition of nationalism and how you think that plays into populism and the political landscape.
Mm-hmm. I think your definition of nationalism is perfect and is just fine. The question is not so much what nationalism is, but mainly why is nationalism so prominent today. So let's start by saying that there could be two ways of interpreting nationalism. Nationalism as a civic form of participating to the global society. So different people that feel part of the same community, but they come from different backgrounds. And the other is nationalism as cemented by that only and unique aspect, being a citizen, being a member, and therefore a more exclusionary type of nationalism. And when we say that nationalism is becoming central, basically what we're saying is that this second type of nationalism is becoming more central. That is this exclusionary type of nationalism. And the question is, why is this particular version of nationalism so important today? Well, there are a number of reasons, and the reasons change a little bit from place to place. Obviously European and Italian. So let me answer from an Italian and a European perspective. Now, from an Italian and a European perspective, we are, part of this enterprise, the European Union that promised essentially prosperity and peace. And that is what people believed for many, many years. And that is, in many ways, what was delivered for many years. And by and large, the European Union has grown in size, is wealthier than it was, say, 50 years ago. But that promise has not been kept, and not for everybody. Especially in times of globalization, you have a situation now where more people feel that the European Union as a project has been good for some, but not for all, and not for them in particular. Secondly, peace. again, we live in a period of international tensions like never before. The Ukrainian war, before the Balkan War, and so on. And again, Europe is being seen as failing that prospect, that project, that promise. So in front of that, people think probably that we need some kind of other community, alternative to the European Union, that is as an overarching umbrella identity. And what is there? What are the political offers that people can go to? Well, the nation. The nation is a primary entity. The nation is a cradle of personal, social, religious identities, in alternative to anything that is larger, global, and potentially something that is not delivered. So one reason why nationalism is becoming important is because what else was there, the idea of a global community, the idea of a European community, has not worked. And secondly, because you are reacting to a sense of loss, a particular loss of those elements that defined your nationality before, such as a common language, a common religion, and so on. Unlike Americans, many Europeans grew up not knowing that there was a wide, fragmented world out there. I was rereading Catches in the Rye just a few days ago, and even there, we're talking about many years ago, so it was published in 1951. There were an awareness and an acceptance that society is fragmented in religious, in social, in political, in class terms. Not for somebody like me, for instance. I grew up in northern Italy, in a small city, and we thought that somebody coming from the south of Italy was really exotic. And obviously that means that the world is completely different. And that complete difference is not welcomed by everybody, and not particularly these days. So we are really looking to a big success of the radical right in the next European election, unfortunately.
So let's talk a little bit about the moment that we're in as we're recording this program in February of 2024. There has been a surge around the world over the past few years of what we would call populist nationalist leaders. But these groups have always been around. There have always been people who run on this platform, and yet oftentimes they have not succeeded. And yet, in recent years, we have seen more success where they win major national elections. So, what is the difference, in your view, between the conditions that allow a populist nationalist group to win major elections in large countries versus years where the same people even run, but they fall well short? What happens in years where they win that wasn't there in years where they weren't even competitive?
Yes, again, this is a very complex question that I think has several answers. So I'll just go through some of them. Obviously, one important answer is the type of political system you have, whether you have proportional representation or first past the post. Because if you have proportional representation, you're more likely to give power to small groups. Small groups become linchpins in the political system. They can air their views more easily in parliament, for instance. So, one reason are changes in the type of political representation. That means also that different political systems can institutionalize groups in different ways. So, for instance, if you take the UK traditionally never had very strong and institutionalized extreme right groups, simply because the Conservative Party could move and cover the space that they were trying to achieve. So you can go back to the National Front in the Thatcher years. And when, Margaret Thatcher felt that they were becoming too powerful, she would just cover their space and they would decline. Not the same with places where you had proportional representation. Institutionalization is a key variable for these groups. Some people are better at institutionalized than others. But the point is that for many years, the extreme right in Europe was particularly bad at institutionalizing. They would achieve power, for instance, at city level and so on, and they would say things that were either unconstitutional or just over the accepted line. And so somebody like Umberto Bossi's leader of the Northern League in Italy would say, well, we have an easy solution for migrants. We cannonball their boats. You can't do that, it's unconstitutional. So for a long time, they would, gain some votes at city or national level, but not too many. But then gradually they learned first to tame a little bit their discourse, to differentiate their political discourse from often effective and perfectly normal administration at city level. Thirdly, the people understood that their political discourse was something that was there, but was not really serious. People were just behaving in a very disruptive way, but they didn't really mean it. So there's a chameleon aspect of populism that allows them to say things that nobody else says, but also allows them to say things that nobody really believes, but it's fine. It's a signal. So I'm covering the type of political presentation, also talking the kind of political discourse. What has happened in recent years is that they have learned. They've learned to say things that are over the top, but not so much. They've learned to act in a way that they make them acceptable to the center right. So in a number of places, starting with Jorge Haider, but more recently now with the Meloni government in Italy, they become perfectly acceptable as partners by the center right. And this is something that is different, and this is something that makes them more powerful. Then, obviously, there's the opposite, the failure of the left. The left has, in many ways, embraced globalization, embraced the idea that we live in a society in which a traditional working class is no longer there, in which the factory as a place for political aggregation is not there. But the point is that precisely because the left has accepted that, the left has lost some of its credibility. So once you have a left without too much credibility, that doesn't really know what to do about the disappearance of the factory, the disappearance of the working class, the fact that globalization has in fact impoverished many people, that the trade unions are very small now and that people are not joining them anymore. So that automatically, gives a space to the right. So then the right is powerful because the left is not powerful. The right is powerful because it's institutionalized in a way that it wasn't before. And the right is powerful because people want that disruptive, angry message that says we are not happy with the way we are losing money, losing power, and so on. Because in many ways they are. Because in many ways salaries have not kept up with, say, inflation and so on.
Are there any places we'll start with Europe. Are there any places in Europe where the populist nationalist movement has been able to move the overall country's policies in a way that has actually benefited even those that they would say were on their opponent's side? So, there's something to be said, as you said, there may be working class people who do not support, in theory, a populist nationalist party, but the policies that that party brings in do in some ways benefit them, perhaps by keeping more jobs within the country, let's say. And they have, let's say, won them over. Not that that left perspective is necessarily going to vote for the nationalist right, but they sort of stand down from opposing them. Do we see examples of that, or are we seeing significant opposition throughout Europe to the rise of the nationalist populist parties?
Well, I think, as far as I can tell, so far the right is winning, and the left has not really been able to move in the direction you're saying, you're advocating. It would make sense to say, let's protect our jobs, and let's accept to an extent that we can't, open borders so much and so on. But the point is that the left uh, is also in a way uh, limited in the kind of flexibility they can express simply because they are representing increasingly that constituency of marginalized people. Migrants are, a sizable part of the labor market now, and the left cannot too easily move to the right. And to the extent that they move to the right, then there is somebody else to the right of them that is the real article. So people say if I have to vote for something that looks like a pale version of the right, then I vote for the right because they're more credible. Um, there have been attempts to do what you're saying, as far as I can tell, in several places, in the Netherlands, to an extent, even in Italy. But that also promotes a sense of fragmentation of the left itself, because the left, again, is not so unified, and then there are branches of the left that say, no, you're moving too much to the right, and we don't accept that. So at the moment, I don't see really a strong barrier to a big victory of the right. Um, the only the only good thing is that in many parliaments, and even at the European level, there is a tradition of cordon sanitaire, a tradition of essentially uh, creating barriers to how much the extreme right can form alliances. So that sometimes the right is more powerful even in the country, but is simply not able to form governments. And I think, for instance, at the European level, this cordon sanitaire, which is basically the fact that Europe is being ruled by an alliance of the socialists and the Christian Democrats, will probably hold even in the near future. But even there, you have the center right that begins to wonder to what an extent they should stick to the old alliance with the left, and to what an extent they should embrace the institutionalized right. And here is important to stress the institutionalized part, because again, the right is fragmenting itself, and there is an extreme right that is pushed out of parliaments, but there is also a radical right that is becoming much more acceptable, much more able to collaborate with the center right. And again, Italy is probably a good place to look at this process. When the Meloni government reached power, people were very, very pessimistic, and they thought we would have seen a new, updated version of fascism. But in fact, it didn't happen. They are very much holding on to certain key aspects of their political identity. For instance, the political language they use, the word, country, nation, and so on, of course, over in the speeches. But then at the same time, they're very practical. They're more than able to collaborate with the Berlusconi group, the ex-Berlusconi group that is more center-right.
So, from an outsider's perspective, it feels like one of the differences between this period and past periods of nationalist, populist rise in Europe was in the past, a lot of times those political groups were conflict with each other at the national level. So a rising nationalist movement in, say, France and a rising nationalist movement in Germany would end up clashing with each other because they were so focused on themselves. So far, it doesn't feel like we've reached that level. It's more of an internal political conversation. But we all know it doesn't take far to get there. I'm curious, as you look ahead over the next several years, most countries of Europe have major elections coming up, and of course, at the European Union level. Do you think that the continued rise and accommodation of the populist and nationalist movements within countries can remain a peaceful rise? Or do you foresee some challenges where countries begin to come in conflict with each other?
I think I think that they're already coming in conflict with each other. But so far they've been very good at smoothing conflict, at, sort of finding ways around conflict. Give you an example. For instance, if you take the issue of migration, think of Italy as a long strip, protruding in Mediterranean Sea, and so we get people from all over the world. So our pattern of migration is a migration that speaks many languages, comes from different religion backgrounds and so on, and they come to Italy and they're basically trying to go up to the north. And they try to go to the places that are closer to them, either because of language or because of religion and so on. So from the point of view of Italy, it's more than acceptable that they go away. They come because it's impossible to stop them, but they go to the north and cross borders illegally, and then they go to France, Germany, UK, and so on. So Italy, and the Italian right in particular, has been asking for some kind of regulation of this process so that a certain number of migrants would be sent to other countries and not let in Italy and not let go away illegally, because it's bad for the rest of the European Union, it's bad for Italy. Now, the right-wing governments and the right-wing parties of Northern Europe, because they are right-wing and because they are nationalist, they oppose that. So there you have a strong conflict between, say, a nationalist populist government like Orban's Hungary and Italy. And so you would expect a big clash between Hungary and Italy. And, as you know, Hungary is being in many ways persecuted on a number of different issues by the European Union legally. But in fact, this is not happening. They often find ways around it because they have other grounds on which they can form alliances. They can form alliances on, say, the traditional icons of the right, God, the family, against homosexuality, against migrants, at least in terms of political discourse. And so they find other grounds on which they agree and simply skip over those things they can't agree on. And then again, the other issue, obviously, is that because there is this polarization of the extreme right in a number of countries, the institutionalized right is more able to collaborate with each other in many countries. And so far we haven't had a real split between nationalists. I don't think it will happen because I remember that the European Union is an arena for collaboration, and you have to collaborate. So if you want to achieve anything, then you have to vote together. And what is happening at the moment is that there are two extreme right groups in the European Parliament. The ID and the ECR, and they essentially will gain votes next time around in the next election, and they will have an incentive to stick together. So there will be tensions on certain things, but simply because they will have the common enemy of the socialists and the Christian Democrats, they will stick together.
So that is an important part of what you mentioned at the top about what really defines populism is there has to be an enemy. There has to be somebody that you are opposed to. And it's important in many ways for those parties to build up the idea of this great enemy. This is why we have to stick together. Now, that obviously comes with a whole host of potential threats. If you demonize a portion of your own population to the point that people really believe it, it can incite certainly discrimination and violence. Now, historically, a lot of that was geared towards ethnic and racial minorities. It doesn't feel like it has that dynamic this time. It feels like it's more philosophical and political in nature. But are you concerned that we are seeing a demonization of groups of people that at some point in the future could result in active discrimination or, God forbid, violence?
Well, so as I said, the split between the extreme right and the populist radical right is broadening, and you do see violence by the extreme right. They typically create vigilante groups. They attack Roma people, attack Roma camps. They do that. The radical right has a discourse that is equally discriminatory, but they don't engage in political violence, not to the same extent. Why should they? I mean, they're very powerful. They've gained legitimacy within the political system, and anything that would be overt violence would certainly undermine their claim to legitimacy. So they're not doing it. Is it getting worse, or will get worse in the future? Probably not. I mean, it's just sufficiently bad at the moment. I mean, they have changed, for instance, rules governing the way migrants are allocated to, say, different countries. There are centers for the processing of migrants' claims that are, some people say, very close to prisons in many ways. They're there, so they have achieved what they wanted in legal terms. So there's no need to do anything different than that. But their discourse, their political discourse, is still very much against migrants, and very much against anything that is unacceptable. And we have attacks against, say, for instance, gays in major cities at the moment that remind people what they have always said. Now, the other thing that should be said is that this situation is a situation that is not going to change in the near future, simply because migration is not going to decrease in size and in number. Essentially, we have processes like desertification of big parts of Africa, climate change, and so on, that push people away. And so the flow of migrants, which is one of the main areas of political discourse of the extreme right, is going to continue. So one thing I like to do is analysis of political discourse. And if you take political discourses of right-wing groups, extreme right-wing groups, and center-right groups, and liberal groups, and socialist groups, and look at what they talk about, what you typically see is that the left, the center-left, and the liberals talk about many things. Their discourse is very complex, very rich. If you look at the discourse of the political right, the extreme right in particular, it's very simple. They have 4 or 5 concepts that come up over and over and over. As I said, the nation, migration, the danger of migrants, crime, security. So this is going to continue simply because it pays off. Is a very simple structure of discourse, and as you also said a minute ago, is a kind of political discourse that allows for the identification of an enemy. An enemy is there, is clear, and is agreed upon. Whereas if you take the enemy for the left, for instance, well, it's not so easy because it's certainly not international capitalism or, whatever, traditional version of the left would be. And the political discourse of the left is so articulated that is often lost in its complexity.
So, as we look ahead over the next 10 years plus or so, do you see this as a global trend that we're going to see this kind of politics? And let's talk about the discourse in particular. I think that's an interesting point you just brought up. Oftentimes, my experience has been politicians are very good at copying what works. And if they see it's working in one part of the world, they bring it to another part of the world. And already we see quite a bit of nationalist, populist rhetoric in countries, a wide range of countries, from Asia to Africa to the Middle East to Europe to North America. So, do you think that this will just continue to spread for a period of time? That what they see working in Europe will be applied in, say, Canada or in Latin American countries? Or do you think that this form of discourse works better in some parts of the world than in others?
Well, I think it works well everywhere. It works better when you have structured forms of exchange. Like, for instance, the European Union has the European Parliament, and they learn from each other. So the ideas of, say, the French radical right, the Rassemblement National, can be copied more easily by the Northern League in Italy or Fratelli d'Italia, simply because they are familiar with it. So you need something. You need a structure to learn, and then you need some kind of similarities. So, for instance, a certain level of affluence, or a certain lack of education, and so on. But I think you're right. It is certainly the case that there are copycat versions of the right. They imitate each other, and it works. Will it work for a long time in the future? Uh, well, the point is that there is nothing that will limit migration, for instance. Migrations, because, as I said, there are issues of poverty of the developing world, there are issues of climate change and so on, but also very simply because there are huge issues of security. Security is a problem everywhere, and obviously, basically, who are the criminals? The criminals tend to be often poor people. They tend to be overwhelmingly young and overwhelmingly male. And migrants are typically overwhelmingly young and male and poor. So if they have to rely, for instance, on selling drugs, then if you have very conservative laws on drugs, it means that you're almost sure that you have a certain level of structural insecurity in most European countries, because there will always be a certain number of people that can be put in jail because they are selling drugs. And so this is a situation that I don't see will change very easily, and there are ways of making it change. For instance, policies in the way you relate to illegal drugs could be changed, and they have been changing in some ways in the States, and in some ways also in Northern Europe, but for instance, not in Italy, and not in other Southern European countries, or not in certain Southern European countries. So, basically that this type of phenomenon that you identified will continue as long as we have these recipes for marginalizing big sections of the population, for creating security problems. Will anybody learn? Well, difficult to say, because again, many populist parties are becoming government parties. Obviously, they will have to solve the problems themselves, and sometimes they will find that there's a big contradiction between what they promised before and what they can actually achieve. This is typically the case of, say, for instance, the government of Italy, the Meloni government. They promised a lot of new security measures before they were in power. They promised the more conservative policies in terms of, say, lifestyle issues. But now they find it very difficult to deliver that. The number of migrants is actually increasing as opposed to being decreasing. I mean, in a different way, you can look at the UK as well. The UK doesn't have a proper right. Some people have talked about exceptionalism of the UK, but certainly as a populist wing of the Conservative Party. And again, they promised a lot, in terms of limiting migration, which led, among other things, to Brexit. But if we look at the numbers now, the number of migrants is actually increasing, is not decreasing. So at some point they will be facing the problems they've, in a way, created by promising too much. But, I'm not too optimistic simply because the electorate doesn't have a long memory, and, the same promises can be made again and again and again.
And having studied this, I'm curious what your view is about populist parties when they do get into power and they do start having policies implemented. We have seen here in the United States, for example, that oftentimes the right wing starts to fight amongst itself. Once the left wing politicians or candidates are sort of pushed off of the main stage, there then becomes an argument about who is the most populist, who is the most conservative, what is the proper route for that. Do you see the same dynamic in Europe and other parts of the world where once populism does become mainstream, there becomes a fracturing within it, and now we have a new political dynamic?
No, absolutely. I agree with this view. The right grows, it becomes institutionalized, and then splinters. Or sometimes it's even splintered before, and the splinters become more and more distant. I mean, the typical example would be Italy, for instance. At the moment, the big tension is within the government coalition, not between the government coalition and the left. The left is very weak, is very unable to unify, but the right is equally tense. The Northern League, for instance, has taken a much more radical right direction, whereas the Meloni government, the Meloni group is becoming more institutionalized, and so they're now fighting a lot, fighting for the true essence of populism, who is more right-wing than the other. And this is happening all the time. But again, the point, although correct, is a point that there needs to be sort of limited in the sense that tensions tend to emerge at particular points in time, sort of near elections, for instance. But then after an election, they find ways of reconciling their differences. So at the moment, for instance, a lot of extreme right groups in Europe, in Italy, but in Europe in general, are in a very tense confrontation with each other. But this is simply because we have an election coming up. After the elections, they will take stock, and some will have won, some will have lost, and they will allocate resources according to the outcome of the election.
And we spent a lot of time in this conversation today talking about governments and elections and the formal arenas of power. But I think it's fair to say that populism and nationalist rhetoric appears in media, it appears in culture, it appears in pop culture. I'm curious, from your view, how important it is for those parties and those movements to not just have power within the formal structures of government, but also within those informal societal structures at the community level, in the pop culture, in the media, in music for that matter. And have they had the same success culturally in Europe as they have politically?
No, I don't think so. I mean, culturally, um, the typical populist electorate traditionally is an older electorate, is an electorate that is undereducated, and is an electorate that is marginal and lives in peripheral places. So they are not the vibrant parts of the culture of any particular country. There are, examples of culture by the right, say white music, for instance. And the right has always been very aware of their marginal role in culture, trying to acquire it, trying to acquire decent intellectuals, for instance, representative intellectuals, and mostly they have failed. But, on the one hand, I see what you're saying, culture is important. On the other hand, culture is important, but people vote, and they vote with or without culture. So we might have a very vibrant civil society that is not populist, but at the end of the day, that is not so important because people, even without a vibrant civil society, vote for the right. So the question is, why is the right not able to acquire this culture? They have political power. Why don't they have cultural power? Well, they don't have cultural power simply because, traditionally education has been embedded in universities that are better at transmitting values of inclusiveness and openness and so on. Will it change? I don't see it changing very easily and very quickly. Certainly not in Italy. I wouldn't say. I lived for long periods of time in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in Belgium, in the UK, and I still don't see, a credible right-wing alternative to the cultural domination of the right, of the left. And again, if it happens, I think it would be very good, but in the sense that if you have to have a right, you might as well have a cultural right and a right that is intelligent and articulated. But it's not going to happen tomorrow, I don't think.
You've been very generous with your time with us today. I want to give you a couple moments to preview a book that you have coming out in just a couple of months, right?
Well, more like 5 or 6 months, but yes, is a book on Europe and the rule of law, and is edited by myself and Professor Luisa Antonioli, who is an academic lawyer, and is coming out about 6 months from now, from Springer. So it's a book with 17 chapters, and each of these chapters looks essentially from a political perspective or from a legal perspective at the several violations to the rule of law in the European Union, and how the civil society, how political parties, how intellectuals, how judges and the legal system can oppose the political domination of the radical right in Europe.
We will keep an eye out for that, and we'll certainly promote it when that book comes out. Maybe we can have you back to talk about some of the specifics in there when the book is
Love to.
published. Yeah, absolutely. We'll also include a link to your personal website, so if folks want to learn more about you and some of your writings and teachings, we'll have that all available in the description of this program. Carlo, thanks you very much for taking some time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure, and we look forward to seeing you again.
As always, we covered a lot of ground in the last hour or so. I encourage you to go back and listen to this episode again. Maybe you have to listen to it a couple of times. Maybe you just have to listen to a couple of clips a few times. We try to make that easy for you. I put show notes on our website, brianjmatos.com. You can search Carlo Ruzza and find the show notes from this episode. We've also begun to put some timestamps on there so that you know if you're just looking for a specific clip, you can jump right to that. My website's probably the easiest way to do that, but if you've downloaded the show or you have it as part of your podcast subscription feed, you can also fast forward and just use my show notes as a guide. So I'm not going to go into every single detail of what we went back and talked about, but I think if you go back to the very beginning of the conversation where we established the definitions that I think are critical to understand about what is the rule of law, what do we think of as the definition of populism and nationalism and their general interplay with each other and where they play within and outside of the rule of law. I think it was also valuable to listen to some of the specific examples. Obviously, Carlo is most uh, adept at Italian politics, living in the country and having spent most of his recent years there. But we covered a fair amount of ground outside of Italy. And I think the other part that was really interesting to me, and I'd researched this before we got into the conversation, but when populist parties gain political power, they do tend to struggle to gain cultural power and cultural influence. And I think that's a fascinating point, and I encourage you all to re listen to that, form your own opinion on this. But I will say, in the United States, at least, where I live and I can comment on, I feel like the populist nationalist movement has made some progress on this. I agree they have struggled. The arts tend to be a sector that don't lend themselves well to that world view of uh, of internal looking. It's sort of a natural instinct of people in media and movies and entertainment to think big and think global, frankly, because they want attention. It's part of what they do. They're creators. They want everyone to hear what they have to say or create or draw or paint or make in terms of movies and television and music. But there certainly has been, at least here in the US, some creation of a more nationalist, populist media outlet and some media companies. They're not nearly as big or as profitable or as successful, but they're there. There are some in our Hollywood. There are some in our music industry. There are some popular artists outside of acting and music that have a political view that is more of a nationalist view. So I'm not sure that that trend will 100% hold, but there is a natural tension there between the governed and those governing. And it does feel like one example of that may very well be our tension in the US, our longtime tension between our more right wing political party or parties and Hollywood. It's not new. It's been going on for decades in the US, and it's a natural tension, and yet somehow it hasn't led to anything more than just squabbles about music or movies or the content thereof. But it will be interesting to see as this movement continues, do we start to see a version of the far right, the populist nationalist right, that shows up in a more mainstream cultural impulse and not just confined to the halls of Congress in our case or parliaments around the world. So that's interesting to me. I'm going to go back and listen to that section a couple of times. I might even go back to Carlo and pick his brain a little further on that. You know, the other thing that I will point out that was fascinating to me in this conversation was the idea of the demonization of groups and the potential for discrimination and violence. It's not a given. That is not how a populist party or a nationalist party has to go. That's a choice. There is no natural need for political gain to demonize a group of people to the point that you will have active discrimination and violence against them. That is always and everywhere, in my view, the choice of those leaders to take it there. You can win power by putting up significant opposition and calling out your differences without calling for violence, without calling for or tolerating active discrimination. And then the last point that we covered in here towards, I think it was about it's probably going to be around the 45-minute mark. I haven't got the show notes in front of me. But we did talk about the fracturing of populist parties. this is where I think a lot of the populist movements ultimately break down. As any movement does, when it gets too extreme, it starts to fracture. And one of the things that we're seeing in Europe is that the general left, as we may call it, the center left parties and the left wing parties, they have struggled to gain back political power. But in their absence, once populist nationalist movements take over, they then begin to fight among themselves. A purity battle. Who's the most nationalist? Who's the most populist? Who is the most patriotic? And it's never enough. You have to constantly push further and further to the right. You have to constantly try to pass these tests, these litmus tests about how pure you are in your nationalism and your populist views. So this is something I'm watching for in the United States, in Europe, and throughout the world where there are populist movements, is to see if that fracturing begins to take place. I don't think I've seen a ton of it. Here in the United States, the right is relatively united, but we won't really know until our November elections and we see what the turnout looks like to see if that ends up being the case. Look, I thank you all for dedicating time to listen to this program. I hope it was as informative for you as it was for me. This is a trend and a topic that's not going away, and you're going to have to interact with it, whether it's within your families or as your businesses navigate a more populist, nationalist world where topics like free trade may not be a given as they used to be, and where conflict may be more routine and, in fact, stoked for political gain. It's important that we understand these and that we can talk in a common language about these terms and these topics. So, this was a fairly academic program. Now, our next episode will be a little bit of academia again, but we hope to bring it up a level, perhaps, to more of a general conversation about demographics. Bradley Sherman is going to return for his second conversation with us. He was one of our most popular guests in our last series in season 1. So in season 2, we bring him back to talk a little bit more about demographic trends globally. We're going to get into some details we didn't in the first episode, and we are going to take the election angle on this one, using the U.S. election as our baseline, but we're going to talk generally about how demographic groups might break out and break down. But we're not just going to talk politics. We're going to talk business as well. And if you're a leader of a company, leader of a business, or you're just part of an organization, you know the demographic pressures inside your company. You know how challenging it is becoming to get the new generation of workers on the same page as the greatest generation that's still at the twilight of their careers as they are exiting the workforce, or even as you get into baby boomers. It's more complicated than just young versus senior, experienced versus inexperienced. But there are wonderful opportunities in this, but also things that we all need to be aware of from a business, political, nonprofit, even from a religious standpoint. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out over time. And there's nobody better than Bradley Sherman to come back and talk with us about that. So I invite you to join us for our next episode. Look forward to speaking with you again soon. In the meantime, I invite you to once again subscribe to this show anywhere you get your podcasts, the Brian J. Matos podcast. Visit my website, brianjmatos.com, and go find that YouTube channel, subscribe, and get the latest clips from our episodes as they are released. Thank you all again for spending time with me, and I hope you will all remain and stay curious.